The Yashica Yashinon-DX 45mm f1.7 lens was made by Yashica in Japan from 1966 until the mid-70s. Now that's specifically the DX. This was a general walk-around lens attached to various Yashica rangefinders, specifically the top tier of Yashica's rangefinder line, the Electros. So if you've ever shot with a Yashica Electro, you know how good this lens can be. If you're new to this series, there won't be any test charts or situations that intentionally set this lens up to succeed or fail. This review series is based on real-world use and aims to provide images and, if applicable, video that mimics how you are likely to actually use this lens. The Yashinon-DX 45mm has a focal length of 45mm and a diagonal angle of view of 51.4 degrees. The aperture range is 1.7 to 16. The front filter thread is 55mm. On the Yashica Electro cameras, the closest focus is 0.8 meters, but with the adapter that I made for mine after I harvested it from a parts grade Electro body with a good lens, that focus distance is actually around 7 inches. It's manual focus only. The systems that it was originally available for include only the Electro line of camera rangefinder cameras. However, if you obtain a good lens on a dead or parts grade camera, then these lenses can be adapted to any of the current mirrorless systems. This video features shots from this lens on Sony E taken with the A7S II and the A5000. As for the lens's weight, it's hard to say exactly because it came with a camera. My adapted lens with the focusing helical weighs in at 206.9 grams. So the Yashinon 45mm is a classic double-gauss design, and it performs well for it. The double-gauss design has a number of really good advantages for lens design use. The primary one is that it controls chromatic aberration very well across the entire image plane, and that's true even with digital sensors. There are some downsides. They can exhibit some barrel distortion, and they can also exhibit some field curvature. Now, we will see exhibits of the field curvature. I don't know that the barrel distortion on this one is severe enough for it to really show up in the images that you're going to see. For sharpness, Yashica's technical publications from the time indicate sharpness in the 120 to 170 line pairs per millimeter range. Of course, that's under ideal conditions and at the optimum aperture. That is good, by the way, and it means that this lens will perform well with modern film stocks and will outperform many of them in terms of resolving power. If you assume that each line pair per millimeter doubles, because they're pairs that are counted, then the actual rating is higher in terms of the number of lines that are resolved on the image plane. So let's put that in digital terminology. These lenses will resolve at a sharpness between 49 and 99 megapixels in full-frame sensor terms. In all probability, the lens resolves around 170 LPMM at the center and around 120 LPMM at the corners, maybe a little bit lower, again under optimum aperture and shooting conditions. And so at f16, for instance, or f1.7, those ratings will be lower. But that means that as long as you're under 49 megapixels on a full-frame sensor, you can pretty much pull everything that these lenses have to offer out of them. As for build quality, it's very good to exceptional. It was not easy to remove the Electro body from this lens. However, the lens is self-contained and it didn't fall apart upon removal like Minolta and Olympus rangefinder lenses do. So that was nice. The aperture is one of my very few complaints about this lens. It has 5 aperture blades, which is not many, and it leads to very distinct out-of-focus area highlights. So were I to change one thing about this lens, I would have put in more aperture blades for a more circular aperture design. And honestly, since this was a rangefinder lens and there was no optical viewfinder preview, and the aperture leaves always open and closed with the aperture ring being adjusted, cost savings had to have been the only reason not to make the aperture more circular. For out-of-focus area characteristics, there is some swirliness at wide apertures, especially 1.7, if you focus within about 10 feet, and it's noticeable then behind your subject. That can be a bit jarring if you don't like that look, and a lot of people would assume that this indicates lens coma. There is a little bit of coma, but that's not what causes this. This is caused by field curvature in the central part of the lens's focus plane, because coma happens towards the outside of the image circle. Field curvature happens more towards, well, it can happen anywhere, but this manifestation of it is more common in the middle of the image circle. Now, that look can provide subject isolation and give you a swirly background image aesthetic if that's what you're going for. Also, sometimes wide open, and stop down just a little bit, the specular highlights have that bright perimeter ring that some people really hate, and that I can go either way on depending on how it's used in the image. Stop down, the specular highlights take on a very pentagonal shape, and after a couple of stops do lose that bright perimeter ring. At some focus points and apertures, the out of focus area can be very jittery, but it's not common. So the out of focus area characteristics vary wildly across this lens's focus point and aperture range, with the specifics of how the circles of confusion are moving through the lens and where they are relative to your subject in terms of depth. So the fact that one lens can have this many different characteristics based solely on focus point and aperture is, to me, exceedingly fascinating, and it makes this lens very enjoyable to shoot with because it can deliver so many different images. As for other design flaws, we talked about the coma and the field curvature in this lens and how they are generally exceedingly well controlled in most instances, and the out of focus area being really jittery. So most of the time the lens's optical design flaws don't translate into anything noticeable in the images. Also, most of the lens's optical design flaws exhibit at the widest apertures, and by the time you're shooting at f4 to f5.6, which is where you're likely to do most of your shooting anyway, the lens's flaws essentially disappear. There is also a very heavy vignette at the wide apertures, especially 1.7. I tend to think that if you embrace that vignette, you're going to walk away happy shooting wide. Flaring and ghosting are exceptionally well controlled. I had to really try to get this lens to flare, and I don't think I succeeded at all in getting any ghosting. Also, there's none of that Bayer pattern reflection that can happen with vintage lenses on digital bodies when a bright point source light is at the edge of the frame. For balance on your camera, for any mirrorless camera, it balances nearly perfectly, and that's because rangefinders were smaller and lighter cameras, much lighter than SLRs, and this lens was designed to balance well with them. So I had no complaints with the balance of this lens on either my A7S II or the A5000, although it does feel a little bit large on the A5000. Breathing will vary based on how you adapt your lens. If you're going to shoot this lens with video, you are going to have to find a parts grade Electro with a good lens and disassemble it, and then make an adapter for your chosen mirrorless camera system. With my adapter, which focuses down to about 7 inches, breathing from that closest focus point to infinity focus is severe. So here are two photos showing the exact same scene and camera placement and subject placement at f16 with the closest focus and infinity. Now here's a third showing a box around the head of my little photo koala at close focus, and a fourth showing that box over the infinity focus image. And this illustrates how much the magnification of the koala's head changes from closest to furthest focus. Here are two photos as well showing a focus range that's more like what you would have seen with the Electro camera, from around slightly under a meter to infinity. And in that case, focus breathing is not nearly as severe as it is. For aperture, it is stepped, and stepped is, yes, the correct term. You could declick the aperture ring if you wanted to, but I would advise against that. Taking the detent and ball out of this aperture would allow too much play in the aperture, and also it's pretty loose. I found that when I was modifying this lens and I took the ball out, the aperture ring moved very easily to the point that bumping the lens would adjust the aperture. Forget panning or walking or anything like that. The aperture on this really needs that ball and detent step system to prevent it from opening and closing when you don't want it to. So I strongly recommend just living with the stepped aperture on this if you plan to use it for video. The front element is stationary, meaning that you can use gradient and CPL filters both for still and video, and also for video if you need to put this inside of a box or other such appurtenance, you can do that, and focusing will not rotate that box. In terms of focus throw, I don't have an Electro handy to check this for sure, and I couldn't find the information online, but I recall the focus throw being somewhere in the 90-degree range on the Electro camera. So if you adapt yours to use the focusing helical on the Electro camera, you're going to have minimal focus throw. However, if you adapt yours like I did, you're going to have a ton of focus throw. I think it's around 200 degrees. The focus ring is stationary on the Electro and also a little bit narrow. So if you adapt your lens for video off of an Electro, you're not going to have much throw. Your focus ring is going to be pretty narrow, but it stays in the same place. If you adapt this with a macro helical for your mirrorless system like I did, then the focus ring is not stationary and it will move in and out as you focus. On the 25 to 55 millimeter macro helical I used to create a focusing helical for this lens adapter, focus ring horizontal movement is inconsequential due to that helical's grip width. So your mileage on this metric is going to vary based on how you modify your lens for video. The same holds true for focus damping and focus ring play. Now, in both of those cases, I remember Electro cameras having poor damping and a lot of focus ring play, but I couldn't tell you if that's due to decades of use or the camera's design. With my focusing helical, there's a very heavy damping and no play whatsoever in the focus ring. As a subjective take on video as well, this lens's speed gives you good low light capabilities. Also, the sharpness is basically ideal for video formats. I find that the color rendition with this lens on video is exceptional and that it yields motion footage that has excellent color trueness and depth. The phototypes that are easiest to achieve successfully with this lens will depend on how you are using it. So if you have this lens on your Yashica Electro film camera, then you're limited by your minimum focus distance. That said, this lens was designed for portraits and vacation photos on those cameras and as a general all-around lens, and it does that exceedingly well. The Yashinon-DX on an Electro can take, with fairly reliable results, around 90% of the image types that you could potentially shoot in a serviceable to exceptional manner. Subjects that would almost definitely not work with this lens include specialty or niche subjects. There were some auxiliary lenses, a wide angle and a telephoto that Yashica made for this lens, but without those, this would not be an ideal lens for wide angle or really any landscapes in general. It can do them, it's just not the best option. It also wouldn't be perfect for extreme close-ups and macros and so forth. The focal length also does not lend this lens to general wildlife shooting unless you can get dangerously close to your subject. Now, the exception to this would be things like ptarmigans, which are just cute. They're not going to hurt you. They're going to make little cute ptarmigan noises, or in most insects and things like that. I would not use this lens to photograph bears or lions or poisonous cobras. Guess they're all poisonous, but you get my point. If the animal can hurt you, You don't want to be close enough to take a picture of it with this lens. If it can't hurt you, this lens is probably going to do a very good job of photographing that animal. The Yashica Yashinon-DX 45mm f1.7 lens is a versatile all-around lens. If you can get a ruined Electro camera body with a good lens, and those are worth waiting for to avoid ruining a good camera, then this is a fantastic general purpose camera on a mirrorless digital system. If you create an adapter like I did, then the close focusing distance of less than a foot makes this a hyper versatile lens that's perfect for insects and wildlife photos as well. It really can be the only lens you use, and you can do a ton with it. Amazingly, this lens performs beautifully up close, which it was never designed to do. The Yashinon-DX also flatters subjects beautifully, especially portrait subjects. It's sharp enough to capture detail, but soft enough, especially wide open, to obscure most blemishes and fine wrinkles. This is also good for general photography as a 50mm lens replacement if you find 50mm lenses to be too narrow and restrictive. Also, to the folks who own the Yashica brand, if you still own the rights to this lens design, this would be a great dumb lens for mirrorless systems. It should be pretty easy to make, pretty easy to fit with a rounded aperture, and pretty easy to make focus to a very close focus point. If you plan on releasing another Yashica branded product, rather than releasing a film camera, here is a lens that could be sold on the mirrorless market with minimal R&D effort to push it out the door to start making money. On a final note, don't destroy a perfectly fine Yashica Electro to harvest the lens. Set up an eBay or similar auction site, watch list for parts Yashica Electro, and wait until one comes up with a ruined body but good lens. Took me 4, maybe 6 months to get the camera that I harvested a lens from, and it was worth the wait. Remove the lens. You can then, at the back of the lens, there's a little thing that pops out of the back of it, a little rod. You can turn that to arm the lens, and then there's another one you can use to fire the lens, and set it to bulb, fire the lens, keep that thing jammed a little bit, and put a little dollop of non-expanding glue, like an epoxy or a clear Gorilla Glue, where that little trigger is. You do not want to get glue into the aperture mechanism. And make sure that that trigger stays open until that glue has set. And that's a really good way to keep that lens shutter open. I did that. Eventually the glue failed, and I had to go in, open up the front element, push the leaves open physically, which they did just fine, and then put a couple dollops of plyo bond, talking half the size of a pinhead dollops, on the leaves, at 2 or 3 of the leaves as I finished pushing them open, and have not had any issues with the shutter reclosing again, which it had done a handful of times on me. Okay, so all that aside, once you get that done, you just need to cut the back little protrusions off of the lens to make a flush mount, and then you mount it to an M42 step-up ring or straight onto an M42 25 to 55mm macro focusing helical, and you just do that with glue. You're going to have to glue this on. On the back of that M42 helical, you slap on a 1mm thin adapter from M42 to the mount of your choice, and then you go to town with an amazingly versatile and high-quality lens. Now, those measurements of the macro helical assume an 18mm flange to focal distance like the Sony E mount has, as well as EOS M. I think those are the only two that are exactly 18. And my lens focuses very slightly beyond infinity with that setup. So if you have a different flange to focal distance, you can use those numbers and the flange focal distance of the Sony to rough out what sizes you're going to need for your focusing helical and step rings. And then just fit it up with tape and obtain infinity focus before you glue anything. So I will say this is one of the most enjoyable lenses in my Sony kit and definitely the best of the lenses that I've adapted to Sony. It's my go-to lens for many of my videos, including almost all of the cameras and coffee series that I make here, and every camera manual I've recorded since going to 4K. Even in 2020, 54 years after this lens design first arrived on the market, this lens holds its own, and it's better than any of the brand new third-party lenses of similar specs that I've tried. It's also better than very many of the kit 50mm lenses and 50mm class lenses for any of the SLR systems from the last 54 years. Not all of them, but many of them. This lens is hard to beat, and if you have a good one on a bad Electro camera, adapting it to mirrorless will not disappoint you. All of that said, this lens is at its best on full frame. It's decidedly not worth the investment to mount it for APS-C or Micro Four Thirds use only. If you do plan to use this on APS-C or Micro Four Thirds, then you need to think of this as a portrait lens with the sharpest parts of the lens's area in use and in your image circle, but the majority of the image circle that lends this lens its unique image characteristic falling outside of your image sensor's area.